Hi, this is Dan Buller, retired electronics engineer, sitting on the front deck of my houseboat again. It's lovely, it's springtime. I found this article that Ryan Williams wrote. He's a guy who was very supportive of me in my pursuit of harmonics and stuff. And he's done this amazing job of designing a communication system using frequency shift keying and encoding, and I warned him about frequency shift keying. I'm not a big fan unless you do it right. And I want to go back and tell you about how I came to have an opinion about how frequency shift keying works. One thing you have to realize, amplitude modulation is clean. I mean really, really clean. Okay, there's a problem with static, but that's induced by lightning and other things called static that cause the reception of AM to be a problem. But in the transmission of AM, everything's clean as a whistle. I mean, the spectrum is very, very narrow for AM, and it's really beautiful because nothing goes outside of 2 times of whatever your bandwidth is for your voice or your music or whatever. But with FM, frequency modulation, which does sound better because it's not influenced by static, but FM is extremely dirty. Frequency modulation is extremely dirty because the sidebands spread all over the place. In fact, the problem with FM is even though it's a radio technology, it spreads so much that you need a huge bandwidth for just one station. So you could put 10 AM radio stations in the space of one FM station. So that's the way it works. FM is really horrible. And frequency shift keying shares some of the downsides of FM, unless you do it right. Now, when I was working at Maxim, this was years ago, I was working on a project for a test program for an analog multiplexer. The analog multiplexer had a zero crossing detector in it. And so what would happen is, if you chose to move from, say, a microphone input to a guitar input or whatever, you would make that choice and then the signal would go up and down and all around, but the multiplexer wouldn't begin to even switch until the input signal on the microphone went to 0. And so when it goes to 0, it starts to switch. So it basically mutes the output. And then it waits for the other input, the one you're switching to also go to 0. So it waits and waits and waits, and there's a timeout. But it waits, and eventually the other input goes to 0, and it does a switch. And that's based on the assumption that if a switch happens at 0, that's the best solution, the best thing that can happen. Now, it sounds reasonable. It really does sound reasonable. But it turns out it ain't. Now, I was working on this years ago when I was working at Maxim because I was doing a test program for a device. And I wanted to verify that it really did work the way I thought it did and that I could prove it. I looked at it and it really didn't work right because even if everything's perfect, everything lines up perfectly, you get a big discontinuity when you do this switch, and that causes harmonics. If you look around, you can find devices that still do this, but it's pretty much fallen out of favor. It's not really all that popular anymore. TI makes a part that does that, and pretty much nobody cares about it because although if you read about it, they'll say it prevents the popping and bad sounds coming out of switching from one input to another, it really doesn't cause that much problem. It's a little tiny bit. But when you're looking for a clean solution, especially if you're doing it a lot, and that would happen in frequency shift keying, it would happen all the time, you really want to reduce the number of harmonics you're generating. So just with an audio multiplexer, it's not really that big a deal, but most audio multiplexers are based on the idea of the original, which was a switch. And remember that switches have a big problem. They have contact bounce. So if you flip a switch from one input to another, like a rotary switch or something, you get contact bounce. And that really makes a big clunk. It really makes a terrible sound, and you don't want that. Now, you should know that contact bounce is a big problem with switches. That's one reason why most devices that use a switch have a debounce circuit in them. And basically it's an RS flip-flop. So just an RS flip-flop, take the bounce out of the switch, and so the signal goes from a low to a high or a high to a low once. It doesn't bounce around. It takes all the bounce out of it. So you don't trust switches. You really don't want to trust switches for anything with analog. What I did was I tried this experiment. So I had a waveform at one frequency and I switched to another frequency at the zero crossing. And you can see very clearly that there's a big discontinuity there. And you know what happens when you have a discontinuity. It creates harmonics, and that's a bad thing. Now, it happens in the middle. And remember that a lot of my stuff on harmonics shows you the things that happen in the middle have very little impact versus things that happen at the peak. But it turns out that's not always the case. If you do something at the zero crossing with a waveform, it has very little impact. But if you do something with two waveforms at the zero crossing, you switch from one signal to another, you get a big discontinuity and it causes a lot of harmonics. Now if you clip the peak, that's a problem. It creates a lot more harmonic distortion and you get a lot of bad things happening. But I did an experiment. I took the waveform and I waited until the signal went to, say, the negative peak. And then I switched to the other tone with a negative peak at the same point, and it was, you can hear it. It's almost perfect. So the discontinuity really doesn't show up when you switch at the peak. The problem is, the big problem, is that you can't get these things to line up this particular way in a lot of instances, like with an audio signal. Well, if you switch at the peak and then wait for another peak of equal amplitude, you could be there for days. So you really don't want to do that. But there are ways to do it with FSK. With FSK, you're in control. So what you can do is you can have them be very closely related to each other so that after like 100 cycles of a waveform, you can make them line up, they automatically line up again. That you can do that easily. It's pretty easy to do. So you have to design it that way. So basically, PLL or whatever, you have two frequencies. If you're doing FSK, frequency shift keying, two frequencies, one at one frequency, one at a slightly higher frequency or a slightly lower frequency, and so the peaks will line up like 100 cycles later or something like that. So then you switch after 100 cycles, and you never switch any other time, and you can do perfect FSK work that way. Now, I've never done this in my career. I've experimented with it, but there's some other interesting options you can do with a zero crossing detector. I did an invention for Maxim. That's one of the problems I was at Maxim. I was a test engineer. I didn't do design. I couldn't do design. They wouldn't let me do design because I didn't have a background for it. But I came up with a design to do a multiplexer with a function that would reduce the pop. That is, the harmonics are created by the switching. And so what you do is, when you change the input from, say, the microphone to the guitar or whatever, so what you do is, you take the one input and you pinch down the signal. you just reduce the amplitude. And it's really easy to do with a multiplying DAC and a counter. So you have a counter that counts from maximum to 0, and it pinches the signal down. So it basically reduces it down to 0. Then you switch, and then you take the other input and you switch it up to full scale. So if you do that, that comes out really clean, really, really clean. It's a very clean sound. It doesn't make a terrible noise, and I bet they do that in a lot of cases with a lot of audio devices. But I don't know because I haven't been in the business for a couple of years. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do if you pay attention to what you're doing. If you forget about switches, don't use switches. If you use a switch, debounce it. Whatever you're doing, make sure you do it very, very accurately. And yeah, you can put a spectrum analyzer on, see if it works, but use an Applicos. Don't use a spectrum analyzer. Use an Applicos and Audio Precision to make sure that you're getting the right answer. Anyway, I better go. There's a truck coming. So, really cool stuff. So once again, from the river, there's Dan Bullard. See ya.